Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with Jump. This week we're discussing contingent recruitment. Is it dead? Is it disrupted? Or is it evolving? And as usual, we'll start, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. Be much appreciated. If you're watching it anywhere else, just follow Jump anywhere. Okay, so let's look at the market and what's going on in the market. So, as always, wants to get a few market stats out there to see what's going on. The recruitment market valued in 2024, 2025 at 40.6 billion pounds. So, it's a bit of a drop from 2023 when it was valued at 44.4 billion pounds, so just over a 4 million pound drop. Okay, and that's a reflection on the cooling marketplace that's going on and what's happening in that marketplace. The enterprise growth, so the GVA, the number of recruitment enterprises in the UK grew. So in 2025, it went up to 31,345, which was up from 29,000 in 2023. So although a lot of people are saying a lot of recruitment agencies are falling out, we're actually growing in the numbers on there. But the vacancies, okay, vacancies stood at 721,000, so basically flat. But I'm going to look at that. So if you look at the permanent market, and all these stats came out of the RAC, the ONC, and other areas, the estimated permanent market placements in 2024, because we haven't got 2025 yet in, was 563,400 placements were made in 24, which that's a 33% decrease on the year before in 2023. We've had 30 consecutive months of pipeline of permanent appointments declining for the 20 months. The temp market, though, however, temporary and contract placements account for 76.7% of the total marketplace. On average, on any average day in 2024, there was 872,000 workers either on contract or temporary assignment out there. The ONS said on average, approximately 1.6 billion temporary workers are in the UK, and that was on the end of October 2025, which is a 4.5% increase year on year. The market share, though, if you look at market share, 85% of the total businesses in the recruitment agency market are contingency recruitment agencies. However, the success rate is roughly sits at 25%, meaning that 75% of the time you're not paid for your effort. PSLs, there's been massive margin pressure on PSLs. If you look, for example, construction PSL margins fell to 13.3%, which is the lowest it's been in 2025. And there has been some shift. Many PSL are moving towards what they're calling outcome-based pricing. And 44% of the agencies are now linking fees to candidate retention metrics rather than just placement metrics. And finally, retention periods. Okay, if you look at retained solutions and placing retained solutions, one of the things they looked at was retention periods. Candidates placed via retained models have a 90% retention rate for 12 months, which is significantly higher than 70% retention models that come from contingency placements. You look at then growth models, recruitment agencies no longer, or recruitment people who use recruitment agencies no longer see retained as exclusively for the C-suite. They're starting to see it for every single role. And despite perception, retained being more expensive, lots of agencies now are offering retained search at the same total cost as contingency, but they are structuring very different services to that and moving forward. So is contingency dead, or is it disrupted, or is it evolving? As usual, Dave and I are going to dissect the market. So please add your comments, put any questions you want into the chat pot as we move forward from there. Dave, first question then. If a recruitment agency came to you today and told you their revenue was contingently perm or contract or temp, what's the first thing you'd tell them to change and why?
I guess the first comment I would make, Howard, is that your stats, I think, were excellent, but there are many areas of the recruitment sector where contingency is still growing and clients are very much relying on us as agencies to supply contingency recruitment. Often it's at a lower margin, as your stats prove, but it's still very strong. Although it's down, it's still quite strong, and it depends on the sector. The questions that I would ask somebody is, what is your average length of contract? So are you placing people, which a lot of companies do, for 3 or 4 hours? For example, a cleaning job, maybe 1.5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So you've got 7.5 hour contract there. How much of your business is that last minute, lower margin, hourly pay? What and what percentage of it is exclusive to you? So when a client does come to you and says, I'd like you to fill this job, have they gone to 3 or 4 other companies? And is it a first to the post? And they're the sort of questions that I would want to know because it would help me understand if they are doing what your stats said, they're working on 75% of the stuff and not getting anywhere. And we all know of companies that are absolutely in that position.
I think before I think before I tell them things to change, I want to, like you, I want to ask certain questions. And I want to know what's happening with their average fee stroke margin over the last 2 years. Has it gone up? Has it gone down? Down. Then I'd ask them about their success, their placement ratios. I'd also want to know where 80% of their revenue comes from, because that determines the number of clients, you know, and the average fee rate and their success rate, but it's where they spend most of their time being successful. So if they're only spending most of their time being successful in 5 or 6 clients, because that creates 80% of their revenue, then what's happening from there? And it's these clients that are the lifeblood. So are they exclusive? As you've said, are they on a PSL, or are they just a number of, one of a number of contingencies that feed that client? Okay. And that would lead me to my final questions, which are you supplying perm? Are you supplying temp? Are you supplying contract? Or are you
Yeah.
supplying all of them? And finally, the last question I'd ask before I start to give my answer would be, when was the last time you pitched an innovative solution to that client to either take a piece of work from them or work on a solo basis with them? And it's the answer to those questions that are usually eye-opening, and that shows the fragility, I think, of the relationship. And in the main, it shows how reliant the recruitment business is on a handful of clients. So it states that the relationship that keeps the client believing that competitive contingent recruitment is the solution is because of the relationship you have with that client. It's probably not deep enough. And because recruitment agencies think their agency relationship is trusted and loyal and etc., when actually it's not. And I think that's the bit that we've got to start to think. So when you look at that, the first thing I'd ask them or tell them to change is their mindset with regards to their relationship with their clients, because I don't think they have a strong enough relationship with them to actually go and pitch a different service, an exclusive service, a stronger service. Not only pitch them that, but pitch them increased fees. I think we're scared to do that because we're scared to upset the apple cart with the client. And I think that's the first thing I'd start to go to the clients with and go to my clients with and get them to understand what their relationship is truly like with their clients, rather than the relationship that they have in their mind, which is very different to what the relationship is like with the client's mindset. And I think that's the first thing I'd sort of ask them from there. So, second question then is contingency recruitment actually dying? Or are we just watching a badly or bad contingency agencies die? And what's the difference?
Well, if you take your stats, there is an argument to say the contingency recruitment is dying overall across the whole sector, but we know that that isn't true because, as I said earlier, in certain sectors, contingency recruitment is actually the lifeblood of getting nurses on board, getting some doctors on board, getting warehouse workers on board, forklift truck drivers on board, cleaners, chefs. The whole market around that is actually growing in many areas. It's growing, but the margins are coming down in some areas. Of course, a lot of that business is controlled by huge players who have like Matrix or DePaul or Neuven, those sort of companies who actually control the market, and agencies supply into their systems. So they've got the relationship with the end user, and you, as a provider, you provide into those systems, and that can be very challenging because that's where margins can be really tight. So I don't think we're watching bad players die. I think it's easier than people think it is for some of the players that are finding it difficult to just be a little bit more aggressive with their discussions with their suppliers and also with how they generate candidates for those suppliers. There's a huge shortage of many candidates to fill jobs. So I was with one company, they had over 200 open jobs. At best, they're going to fill 20 of them. They're not working all 200, but they have 200 open jobs where there just aren't enough candidates for them. So the work is there and it is contingent. It's just how you go about it. Some of the big players won't entertain any conversation about retained or paying up front or anything like that because the contracts they've got with their clients just doesn't allow that. But not everybody's working with those big players and not everybody's working through them.
So it's interesting. I think we've got a similar sort of view, but from contrasting sort of viewpoints, because I think the stats prove that it's not dying at all, but evolving. And the smart agencies are now looking at ways to innovate and catch more wallet spend from their clients and deliver different recruitment solutions that actually benefits the client agencies. And I think we've talked about that as the market's changed. I think you end up with three different types of leaders and agencies. You get those that innovate and take the market by the scruff of the neck and shake it up. You get those that keep the status quo, deliver a good service, and hope they do enough not to lose their main revenue streams. And you get those that refuse to change and continue throwing the same old services out there, which are getting poorer and poorer compared to their competitors' innovation, and they're the ones that tend to lose out. So I
Yeah.
think the first
Yeah.
type will always grow and prosper. The second type will survive, and the third type, in the main, will, basically the statistics say that they'll end up with abject failure from there. And I think the difference is easy. Bad agencies have what I would class as a poor transactional relationship with their clients. They're weak, they're subservient to the client, they dare not to challenge, they don't innovate, etc. Because the relationship just doesn't exist. But they think it does. But those that dare to challenge their competitors, dare to be different, provide a different service that the client sees the worth in, they're the ones that who grow. And I go back to 2024, 2025. I saw lots of recruitment agencies growing in the marketplace because they were challenging, they were innovative, they were different. So I don't think contingency is dying. However, I think that for most of the market and for a small percentage of the market that dares to innovate, it is starting to really evolve and evolve really quickly. And I think that's the bit. It's doesn't have you don't have to suddenly put a retained model in, but if you put a better model in and have a deeper relationship with your client, then all of a sudden you will get a different result, and you'll be able to take wallet's share from your competitors. Where at the moment, I think without that innovation, you are just one of a number of suppliers rather than a name of the supplier list. And I think that's the difference that we look at from there. So, question three, we've sort of audited hundreds of agencies. Okay. I know this is going to be a difficult answer, and I know I've skated the answer as well. So, what's the single KPI that tells you immediately whether a contingency agency model is in trouble, and what do you do about it?
For me, the one key, there's a number of key measurements, but the main one I look at is the percentage of jobs received that you don't fill. So if you're working on 50 jobs and you're filling five, but you're still working on 50, that is a huge question for me. That would be the lead question, the lead stat to uncover, well, what's going on here? Is it you haven't got the candidates? Is it you're not? Is it you're just hoping that you're working on all these jobs, some will hit? Is it that the consultant you've got doesn't know the market? It would open up another level of 20 or 30 questions or so that would enable me and the founder or the MD of the business to have a business intelligent conversation about just what is going on here. Because I still see on sales floors consultants getting very excited about receiving a job. receiving a job order or celebrating a job order. And then it gives them something to work on if they're a little bit quiet. And they don't go through the rigor of, well, hold on, hang on, before you start working on this, what type of job is it? Is it a gold job? Is it a silver job? Is it the ultimate platinum job, if you like, where you're retained and you've got the time to fill it? Or is it, dare I say, one of the many jobs that you just got to work on and hope that you can find the right candidate, and then hope that your relationship with the client means they'll take the candidate from you. So for me, it's about the percentage of jobs that you've got that you don't fill.
So I think it's interesting, isn't it? As we've evolved our webinars throughout the years, I always find that I'm going last. So I'm going to give one of 3 or 4 data points because I'm never sure what you're going to come out with because obviously we never confer before. So the audience deserves a variety of answers things on
Yes,
there.
yes, not just two,
Yeah, not
just because
just
there's two of us.
yeah. So I think obviously there's fill rate, and your fill ratio is really important. And you're right. If you're only filling a very small percentage of the jobs that they give to you, then it shows that there's little value in what you're trying to do to the end client from that point of view. But I think client retention is really
Yeah,
important. I think, do you have a reducing revenue stream that's coming on year? Now, is that because the client is suffering, or is that because you're getting your market share taken from other agencies from there? And the final one that for me is looking at the lack of new business that challenges to break into that 80% of your revenue stream. So if you're not bringing new blood in and you're losing your main revenue stream, then you've got a problem. So I think all these 3 reasons give fear, I think, when we start to audit people. And I think poor ratios tell me the client is, I think it shows something that is dropping, but do they believe it's dropping? Because everyone's got a low fill ratio. Well, no, not everybody's got a low fill ratio. I've got lots of clients that are working with plus 70% fill ratios. I've got some clients that are working with a plus 90% fill ratio. So not everyone has a low fill ratio. And you think about that 25% fill
yeah,
ratio, that's appalling, when you think about that. When people talk about revenue dropping, do they measure year on year what's happening from that client? And do they know why that revenue is dropping? Is it because the client is suffering itself and therefore we need to replace that client? Or is it because, as I said before, someone's taking market share from there? So what's actually happening in those? And then when I start to think about once you've got a massive hole, you need to fill that hole. And the best way to fill that hole is with new business. And therefore, if you're not doing new business, then you're in trouble. Okay.
yeah,
And whatever you say, or whatever I say, or whatever we say on here, sometimes it's going to sound flippant. You need to address those 3 areas in equal measures. And I'll go back to my last sort of conversation or my last answer to my last question about the clients. Client 1 will be the one that's doing all of those things already. They're reviewing their clients, they're measuring what's going on, they're looking at their fill rate, they're looking at their retention rate, they're looking at their new business, and they're looking at how they can increase market share and what's going to go with that market share. The second will know it's happening, but they'll probably not have a strategy or the accountability to actually address it. And they'll address it in small little parts, but not in the main. And then you've got the final one, the third one, that will just not know it's happening. And it'll be almost become a shock to them when their top client stops recruiting with them and stops using them. And all of a sudden they've got a massive hole and it's too late. So fill rate is success. Reduction year on year in revenue could be because the client's in trouble. But what we're saying is that, you need to constantly increase your knowledge of your client base that's billing from you, revive that, innovate with it, and make sure you're taking what it spend. But you also need to bring new blood into your business just in case they drop out. Now, those clients that were doing that in 2024 and 2025 had huge 2024s and 2025 when everyone's saying it's the worst year ever. In the same markets that people were saying it's the worst year ever. It's just a different of mindset. And I think that's the thing, that it's all about that mindset. So when we start to look at those KPIs in the whole, it's how people measure them, but it's then what they do when they actually measure them. What do they believe? And I think a lot of people don't believe the data that is being produced for them. if they're getting the data produced. And I think that's a major problem because by the time to react to it, it's far too late.
Yeah.
Let's push that a little bit further. Walk us through how you'd audit a contingency agency in a single day. What's it sort of look like? What are you asking? And what are the red flags? What's the red flags for you?
Um, one of the key aspects I look at is what is the relationship with the clients you're servicing. For example, is it via one of the big managed service providers, RPO type companies, or is it direct to the client? Um, who has the relationship? Is it the consultant with the on-site person, or do you, as the owner, have the relationship with your equivalent at the organisation? Be that the on-site provider, or even the company itself that's made the decision to bring the on-site person on, the on-site company on. I think a lot of client relationships, to your point, Howard, about doing business development, you've got to have some sort of relationship or be building that. How do you generate candidates? So in many markets, as we know, the workforce is shrinking. Yeah, in the UK, the workforce is shrinking. There are less skills available for most jobs. So what are you doing to generate candidates? How are you generating candidates? How sticky are their candidates? I was with someone yesterday, 82% of the temps that they provide, when they finish the job that they're working on, they get another job through that agency. Now, when I was back in the day in IT recruitment, we couldn't get that number above five. Slightly different market, slightly different skills. I accept all that. But they work really hard at finding the cleaner, the truck driver, the lorry driver, whatever it is. They work really hard if they're coming to the end of one assignment to make sure they get them to the next one. Yeah. And just over 4 out of 5 times it works. I'd be looking at how the margins are going. What's the trend on margins? Are you down at £2 an hour? Are you down at 80p an hour? Or are you up a bit to 450, 550 an hour? I accept that there are some contract work, which is different. That's 13, 14, 20, £50 an hour, whatever that may be. But in the high volume contingent work, often it's an hourly rate that's 450 and in some cases less. And for me, I've used the same before. You'll know it. The trend is your friend. So show me if I'm on site. Show me the trends, your margins, your charge rates, your calling to get new business, your influence that you're using to win business. I would want to see some of the trends so that we can look and see which way the business is going. Because bizarrely, if you don't look at that, you don't always know where you're going, and you're a bit like an apple kind of apple bobbing, bobbling around, waiting to see what's going to happen next, and you just get swept away.
So I think I've outlined some of the red flags that we see. And I think usually the audit takes the data from being mythical to be right there in front of the client's nose. They cannot see it. It's there. It's undeniable. But I think often denial is seen in the audit, that people deny that type of information. But data never lies, and we talk about that a long time. And if the data's on performance or it's on a CRM, etc., a lot of people say, well, the data's corrupt, it's not all there, etc., etc. So you can't spot trends that you're talking about. And one of the trends we talked about, I remember having this conversation with Neil Carberry on this very webinar
Yes, yeah.
about the shrinking in the employable people in the UK, because the birth rates have been dropping consistently since the 60s, to where it is now. In the 1963, the birth rate was around about 1.1 million children per year. It's now around about 600, just over 600,000. So that's a massive drop in the employable marketplace. And obviously people are working retiring earlier, and therefore there's a massive compound on that. Okay. But if we sort of look at that, if we went, say, back to last week's webinars on KPIs, the leading KPIs will tell you what you're going to do. However, your lag KPIs will tell you what you have done. And so when I'm doing an audit and I pull financial data, that shows me everything I need to know within the state of the business. So if you're not measuring things properly, then you may as well not measure anything at all.
Yeah.
So the audits show everything in the cold light of day, but then it's about the appetite for change, I think, in the owners, in the people in the business, what opportunity they have. And I'll give you a prime example. I was on a service partner call last week with one of the big recruitment networks, and they were talking about how many companies in their network had gone to the wall last year. And I'd audited a number of those companies, from large companies to solo companies. Okay. And at the end of the audit, it was obvious to me what had happened and what was going to happen to that business. And I described it as this way, that most of the people at that audit had run out of commercial runway and therefore had zero chance to recover. However, some had just enough runway to act now, and they had to act now, not tomorrow, now. And if they act now and did the right things, then they could potentially survive. And I'd say 50-50 of those people survived and 50-50 didn't from there. And then had the people who were on the runway, accelerating, the noses started to rise, the wheels are coming off the runway, and they're starting to fly. But the
Yeah.
data told me all of that. And how owners react to that tells me even more about whether or not that agency is going to grow, stand still, or shrink. So the data is really important. And when we use the audits, they tell us so much about a business. But I think the reaction to that data tells us even more about whether
Yes.
they're going to recover
Yeah.
or not. So I think there's
Yeah.
two things on there. Here's a conversation then. If we were advising a perm only contingency agency who was solely dependent on that revenue, or vice versa, a temp or contract agency that was solely dependent on that revenue, what specific services would you tell them to build or change? And which clients in their existing base would you target, get the first development going within the next 90 days?
Well, the first service, if you like, and whether you call it a service or just a different way of presenting what you do, is obviously to get as much of the work as you can exclusive. And I think there's an assumption in the temp market that you can't get work exclusive. But part of that is because the consultants or the leaders or the owners don't believe that they can. So the mindset that you alluded to earlier, Howard, is so true. And it's a combination of mindset and training. If you don't believe something can be done, you won't bother to train people to do it because you don't think it can be done. So why am I going to sit down with my team of people who are providing all of these schools with these teachers and ask them to do it exclusively when I don't believe it happens? I can tell you it does happen. The companies that are doing really well in that temp market are the ones that are winning exclusive business and actually using data to intelligently articulate to the clients, you know what, if you want me to work on this, this is what the market's dictating. These are what's happening in the labor market. These are the trends in Shrewsbury and the surrounding areas. So if you really want us to get people and they're going to have to come in from other places, you're going to have to pay a bit more. And most business leaders who are hiring, most with intelligent data that they can see and read and understand, they will make a positive decision. So, in that context, if you're having an intelligent business discussion about what's going on in the market, and then you say to them, it's better for you and better for us in terms of candidate generation and security, we're going to ask you for 48 hours exclusivity, or we're going to ask you for exclusivity. So that service is what I would begin to ask for. There's other services that you can provide, like retain work. Doesn't apply as well for some areas of contingent, but that's the first thing that I'd look at.
I think it's interesting. So we've worked with on dual clients quite a bit sometimes, and well as single clients. And I think to me, it's that obvious miss of revenue. If you're a temp market but you're not doing perm, there's an instant miss of revenue. If you're a contract market and you're not doing perm, instant revenue, and vice versa. If you're a perm market and not doing temp, instant revenue. And again, that's usually down to the person who's created the agency because they've either come from a perm background or a temp background, so what they know. So it goes back to their mentality of what's going on. And a lot of people then do that very poorly. So they've built a nice temp desk. I'll just use temp as a primary market. They've built a nice temp desk, and they then try get people to dual desk, and so they never get that perm market really moving because the temp market is so all encompassing and so all consuming, for a consultant. So we never get that perm market going. I remember at CP, I remember when I first went to CP, I only did the contract market.
Yeah, yeah, me too.
But I was struggling with our perm team. And so I went to the perm manager and said, look, this is what I want to sort of put into place. I want to put in place that for every meeting that we go on, one of your perm consultants comes with us, and every meeting your perm consultants go on, one of our contract consultants go on. And he was really dead against it. And I said, this is the reasons why. I said, you're trying to sell against contract, and therefore we lose the job. We're trying to sell against perm, therefore we lose the job. So he said, right, I'll trial it for a month. And we trialed it for a month. Oh my God, how much more business did we get? Because the clients could then see us selling the right products, what they needed at the right time, rather than trying to craft a product for what I wanted. I'd rather have it contract than perm and vice versa. So we did that, and we made a massive, massive growth spurt from there. So I'd start with looking at your niche, and to gain traction, I'd start to look at my top billing clients in there and say, what services am I providing to them? Is it temp? Is it contract? Is it perm? Or am I sliding all three? And, you can look at that, and we forget all of that. And I'll give you another slight story. I took over an office in CP, and they had a large government contract, £4 million body shop contract, supplying developers, etc., into a government marketplace. I went down and saw them, and then I had a conversation. Went down with the manager, went down, saw them, and to see what's going on, etc. And as I was leaving, someone called me and said, "Oh, just seen you in Whitehall." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I didn't know you were coming down. Or they've vet you." He was one of my old contractors that worked for me.
Yeah.
I said, "Oh, which part are you working for?" He said, "I'm working in this part." And I went, "Oh, we don't know about that part." We had a £4 million revenue stream coming out of what they classed as the body shop. He was working in an area that was all about high development work, but being done by PwC, those type of clients, etc. So he said, come back, why don't you come back and see my manager in a couple of days' time? So I went back and saw his manager in a couple of days' time. And as I walked in, there was 3 or 4 contractors that had worked for me in the past, all around about £500, £600 a day. I asked the manager, what are you paying for these guys? And he went, oh, we're paying PwC about 2.5 grand a day. And I went, oh my God. I said, you do realize I've had these guys on contract in the last 12 months. He goes on this rate, he's on that rate, he's on that rate. He said, I thought they were all PwC employees. I said, no, they're all contractors. I bet most of these guys are all contractors. And he said, we didn't know you did interim work. We only thought you did body shop work. And so sometimes it's the fact that we're not selling our services to the client properly, and therefore we can't see the revenue streams that we should be getting out of that client. And therefore that stops, we'll go back to the scenario of, going down the runway. It stops our wheels leaving the runway because there's opportunities to lift us up. And we're forgetting those opportunities. And I think most clients have opportunities to gain more market share. If you're talking to one point of contact, where's another point of contact that recruits? Where's another, etc.? Because sometimes it's not the same person that does all the recruitment. But we tend to forget that because we are too relationship bound from there. So I think there's lots of things that we can do to change that. But again, it's that belief system that we need to go in and change that.
Yeah, definitely.
Here's a conversation then. This will lead a bit into next week's webinar as well. A recruitment leader that tells you they can't convert a client into a retained business. I'm going to use retained in the inverted commas because I think there's lots of different versions of retained business. So sole supply is a version of retained. Exclusivity is a version of retained, etc. But if you told they can't get retained business because they won't get the client to pay up front or to go solo with them, what would you say to them? And do you actually believe them?
I would say, show me who said that to you based on what you presented to them. Because 9 times out of 10, a leader will say to the client, potentially, it isn't, actually 9 times out of 10, it isn't the leader. It's the consultant or the manager. And I would want the leader of the business to be able to have the conversation with the client, because we're always encouraging our leaders to get out and build those relationships and put the benefits of retained to the client. And if the client absolutely says no, with all the data that you would present to make them say yes, then that's fine. But if you have 20 of those conversations, 10 of them will be successful. The problem is nobody has 20 conversations. It's an afterthought at best for many, or the conversations are not particularly sold well because the consultants who are having them aren't trained on how to deliver it. So it takes an effort by the business up front to train the consultants or the managers or the client BD manager, whoever it is, who is going to have that conversation to be able to articulate the benefits of having a retained service. So I would want to know specifically, what did you present? How did you present it? Why did they say no? Because if they come up with some genuinely good reasons as to why to say no, that informs the next presentation you do. Because you may put the answers to those objections in the presentation. So if the new client is thinking, I'm going to say no because of this, this, and this, you've got the answer. So I think it's something that should be taken without trying to be uh, too controversial. I think it's something that should be taken more seriously than it is by agencies.
So again, I'm going to give you a slightly different sort of position on that answer from there. I think it's basically down to the relationship isn't strong enough,
Yeah, yeah,
and we're not talking to the right people when we pitch those type of services. And I think that's one of the key changes that I'm seeing in the marketplaces, where we're seeing, you know, senior people in the recruitment industry talking to senior people in the market rather than the end of the line. So we try and sell retained or exclusive and we get rejected. Why? Because the client doesn't see the benefit in either paying money up front, where they've got loads of other agencies are giving it for free, or they don't see the benefit in going solo or going exclusive because they don't understand what that means to them. And I think you have to work on taking your client on a journey. It goes from increasing your service level, increasing the information that you supply to the client, giving them time and reasons why they should go exclusive, go solo, go retained, why it's a better option for them, not just in your eyes, but in their eyes. And we tend not to do that. We tend not to give them that in-depth data in there. So I think the other side of that coin is we simply can't just polish a contingency service and sell it as a retained or exclusivity, etc. We have to do something different. We have to give them a better client value proposition and develop that with them and work that. So next week we're going to develop a whole webinar of moving from contingency to retained or to solo or to exclusive recruitment from there, and we'll give you help you reframe your services over time, so your client becomes dependent on you, not you dependent on them.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
think that's the big call. You are dependent on your client now; they're not dependent on you. So how do you make them dependent on you? That's the question that you need to ask when you start to sell that to that marketplace. So the final question then, what are the actual commercial conversation, or what does a commercial conversation look like when you're telling a long-standing contingency client that the relationship needs to evolve?
I think partly the answer to this, Howard, is going back to what we were saying about using data to inform the conversation. Our relationship needs to evolve because in this market, with these candidates over the next 2 years, there's going to be 32% less of them. The migration policy committee says these are the skills that are coming into the country, and it doesn't include the skills that you want. This is the trend of house prices in the area, so less people are moving in. They're just examples of a business conversation that we could be having right now with a client to say, so you need to be aware. If you're opening a new school, if your academy trust is building this area, if you're running an NHS trust and you want radiologists and physiotherapists, whatever the skill set is, go to the client with the data which is available to us all, data from your system, data from the ONS, data from the REC, data from Jump, whatever it may be, and have the conversation that our relationship needs to evolve, because if it doesn't, what's got us to where we are today isn't going to suffice for tomorrow. And we've got through a webinar without even mentioning AI, but obviously that is also coming into the picture for a lot of semi-skilled jobs. So I think the conversation has to evolve to make the relationship evolve. And most clients would understand that, would accept that, and would say, well, thank you very much. They may not be in a position to do much about it at the time, but they'll be grateful for what you've given them. And if you're not doing it, be worried that one of your competitors is.
I thought long and hard about answering this question, and I thought most agencies class this as business as usual, when actually this should be a focused strategy on itself, because it takes time, it takes proof. Your data will show them commercially if it makes sense, and what you're offering is just as much as a prospect for them as it is for you.
Yeah.
Therefore, we need to, our relationship needs to evolve, and not just with the recruitment line, because that's what we talk about. We normally talk to the recruiter who's giving us the job or the person that's dishing out the job. We need to talk to the decision maker. So developing relationships across the whole business with the power brokers of the business, okay, is critical. And usually it's the power brokers of the business that understand the difference between worth and price. Because usually the end of the line is all about price. The top of the line is all about worth. And if we can understand the difference between worth and price, we're going to have a lot different situation. I'll give you an example. I was with a client last week and we were discussing this sort of topic. And I asked the recruiter, how many of your perm placements have lasted more than a year after you've placed them? And he didn't know. They were running temp as well. So I asked the same question on temp. On average, how many of your temps go beyond the initial period that they're recruited for? How many of them convert to a perm placement? And how many of them get asked back? And they couldn't answer those questions either. So last night when I was driving back from the Northwest, I called the client to see whether he got that information and got that data. Perm. 91% of his perm placements lasted more than 12 months. And he went a little bit further. 86% of the perm placements he made in these clients lasted more than 24 months. Wow.
Yeah.
That's true value to the client, but the client likely hasn't got a clue that that's the benefit of using that agency. That's the quality of the perm candidates that they're placing with them. What's that done for their client? So what a great starting point for a conversation. However, his temp stats were a bit of a killer. 70% of every temp had their assignment extended, but only 10% returned for a second assignment, and only 15% have been taken on permanently. Now, he's going to go away and ask the client, why that is. Is it because of what they've been using for, et cetera, et cetera? But he needs to understand that data. So we need to understand is, does 70% extending sound good or not? Because if it is, then we can start to look at that. But what I said was, if you take that now as your standing point, let's review our stats in 6 months' time for each client. Have they improved? Have they increased? Because that's a great opportunity to go to your client and say, right, at the end of Q1 in 2026, this is what our business looked like. At the end of Q3 in 2026, this is what our business looked like, okay, and what our services gave to you. That gives them a real good opportunity to see the worth of your business. And that's a difference between price and worth. It gives you a focus. So to me, that's a project, not business as usual.
Yeah.
That means that once you get beyond a certain point and you understand the data, what's going on, now when you go and pitch solo, exclusive, retained, etc., now you might get a very different conversation, whether it be permanent or whether it be temp or whether it be contract. You might get a very different conversation with your client, because now they start to see you as a trusted partner rather than a contingency recruitment with a transactional relationship.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
So I think you need to ask yourself that question about your business and what would you do with that data if you took that back to a client? And that doesn't matter whether you're a solo business, whether you're a multinational business, that information shows the benefit that you can add to the client. But it also demonstrates to you if you've suddenly got a very low number, let's say that, out of your replacements that you've made on perm, only 70% last the first year. That's a bit of a question mark about your
Yeah,
quality and
of
your
course,
capability. So you've
of
got to
course.
change that. But that goes back to answering one of the earlier questions about taking the client on that journey over a long period of time rather than trying to sell those products early doors because you haven't got the trust and you haven't got the relationship to actually sell those type of products. And I think that's the problem that we have, that we sell those products too early. And that's, again, a conversation for next week, which we'll move into from there. So, ladies and gents, thanks for attending. Hope you've enjoyed today. If you've got any questions on that, then give us a shout on there. Again, I have produced a workbook to go with this webinar to have a look at your business, and it will audit your business, very briefly audit your business rather than going in depth as Dave and I would normally do. So if you want that, drop us a line to info@jumpadvisory.com. Dave, thanks for your time, much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your time, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Cheers,
See you,
thanks
Dave.
everybody.